Chapter 1. The Unwanted Burden. A great flash. Moments later, a young man appeared in the middle of a meadow, a mage with a short sword at his hip. He wore a white shirt, a turquoise vest, and light linen trousers. He dusted himself off and exclaimed enthusiastically, "A new world, a new me!" Then he started waving his hands about, as if reciting some grand proclamation. This time, no wars, no killing. I'm merely an observer. I'll get to know this world and its people. He immediately began looking around, trying to gauge the nature of this place. Fields stretched far in every direction. In the distance, a forest. It felt like the height of summer. He sensed almost no magic at all. He could hardly remember the last time he visited a world so devoid of magic. He turned this way and that, wondering where he might come across some people, if any lived here at all. Lifting himself into the air, he climbed higher until he could survey the land properly. His gaze settled far off, his destination chosen. There, a sizable city lay. He knew it well enough already, not only because he could sense the presence of over 20,000 souls, but because he could plainly see it. The small city was surrounded by fields of wheat. The mage approached his goal. Even from afar, he could see much commotion. Deciding it must be some sort of festival, he resolved to blend in unnoticed and see what entertainments this brave new world had to offer. But it quickly became clear this was no festival. At least, not in the usual sense of the word. In the main square stood a grand statue of an animal, something like a beaver. Beneath its outstretched paws, firewood had been stacked. Upon those paws lay a small white bundle, a newborn. All around, people had gathered, clad in black hoods that covered their faces. The crowd was shouting something, a bad sign, a very bad sign, especially so early in the exploration of this world. Our hero sighed heavily and began speaking to himself. Why couldn't it be a cult of fine wine? I've seen this far too many times. Must there be such a cult in every world I visit? Last time it was a giant frog, before that a mouse, before that a turtle, and before that a fish. A fish, for heaven's sake. A fish doesn't even have paws. He had forgotten about the beetle cult. Between the cult of the mouse and the cult of the turtle, there had been a beetle cult, exceedingly peculiar and troublesome. He looked around and spotted a young girl in chains, clearly given a place of honor among the onlookers. Judging by her screams and how she struggled against the metal shackles, she was the child's mother. The mage might have thought her beautiful, dressed in a simple white gown, her long golden hair falling delicately over her shoulders, trailing down her back, almost brushing her shapely bottom. Of course, that's if she weren't screaming and thrashing like a madwoman, or someone weren't apparently intending to do gods know what to her child. For a moment he still wondered whether he ought to meddle in local customs. Then he decided that he rather ought. He rose into the air, pulled the infant toward himself with telekinesis, cradled it gently, and then pulled the girl toward him too, chains, wooden platform, and stone block included. Predictably enough, his actions drew an immediate response from the local worshippers of the beaver-like deity. Arrows and bolts soon flew his way, and not just from them. Even the townsfolk unaligned with the cult seemed unimpressed. Stones came next, then whatever rubbish they had to hand, and even, yes, one piece of dung. Of course, for a mage of his stature, this posed no problem. Every projectile bounced harmlessly off his invisible shield of energy. Moments later, all three chains, platform and stone block included, were floating majestically over the city walls. Once they had gone a fair distance from the city, our hero set the young blonde down, along with her chains, platform, and stone block. He landed as well, still holding the newborn. He intended to shed a bit of unnecessary burden. The chains snapped easily enough. He handed the infant back to the girl and was already preparing to fly off in quite the opposite direction from her and his whole cult business. As far from this nonsense as possible. That's when he felt her arms around him. She smelled lovely, a light, flowery scent. Alas, our hero knew full well the girl wouldn't survive on her own. He knew, too, that she'd do anything to save her child, and with a bit of luck, herself as well. He also knew he would probably take advantage of that. Were it not for certain years spent practicing black magic, which had ended in a rather embarrassing affliction. The mage sighed and said aloud in a mocking tone, "Would you not leave a defenseless mother and child to certain death?" As he said it, he nodded solemnly, pulling a face. The girl laughed softly. He embraced her and lifted them both into the air once more. After roughly 3 hours of flying east, the mage decided they were far enough from the wretched town and its less than hospitable inhabitants. He knew it would be wise to find a place where the woman could spend the night. Our hero sensed a small group of people in the distance. The woman, and not just her two children, but the third as well, the youngest. They landed in front of a crumbling, simple mud hut. Without a doubt, it had been built by someone who had no idea how to build even the simplest of mud huts. It wasn't exactly inviting. The only element of the construction that raised no serious objections was the moss growing over the roof. Hard to mess up moss. Most importantly, though, someone lived here. The man left the blonde girl at the entrance and ducked down to step inside. Inside, he found a scrawny, red-haired woman. She looked to be about 30, filthy, with her hair carelessly tied back in a braid. There were also her equally red-haired, equally filthy, and equally scrawny children. A 13-year-old girl, a 9-year-old boy, and a 1-year-old boy wrapped in a dirty cloth. The mage didn't care for filth. He had the luxury of always being able to choose between being dirty and being clean, and his choices in this matter were consistently predictable. Unfortunately, not everyone had such a luxury. Almost all the inhabitants of this far too rustic dwelling were not only surprised but visibly displeased by the unannounced visit. The woman was shouting something, holding a knife. The boy gripped a stick in his hand and bared his crooked teeth. The girl was shouting too, aiming a simple bow at the stranger. It would have been much easier if our hero understood a single word of the local's tongue. But life rarely offered such convenience, even to a mage of his stature. He sighed again. He gestured to the inhabitants that he wanted them to step outside. At that very moment, the girl's hand twitched. The arrow struck the man square in the chest. Silence fell. Silence fell. Long. Awkward. At last, the stranger looked down at the arrow jutting from his chest. He grabbed it and pulled it free, leaving behind a small hole in his turquoise vest and white shirt. He traced a finger around the hole for a moment. He did not like that hole. It had been a very good vest and rather expensive, not to mention the shirt. He handed the girl her arrow back, attempting a gentle smile. He reminded himself he was merely a guest, and such little misunderstandings did happen. Unfortunately, the nervous twitching of his eyelid betrayed a hint of irritation. Before the girl decided to reclaim her arrow, she glanced at her mother and brother. All three of them looked utterly bewildered by the situation. Still, there was something good in that surprise. It seemed to lessen the tension, at least the hostility. The mage gestured again for them to step outside. The woman pointed to her daughter, indicating the infant, and then followed the mage. Her children followed after her. Outside the hut stood the beautiful blonde with her newborn. The girl was trying to coax the baby to nurse, but the child refused, or rather, couldn't. Some of the recent stressful events might have had something to do with this young mother's trouble. The man knew well enough that a lack of milk was a serious problem. He also knew that such problems ought not to be solved by magic. Could be, but shouldn't. He looked at the red-haired woman and pointed at her breast, then at the blonde's newborn. The redhead grimaced in displeasure. He, however, wasn't planning on negotiating. He stepped up to the blonde, gently but firmly took the child, kissed the woman on the forehead, and handed the infant to the redhead. She tried to protest, but deep down she knew there was no point. She brought the baby to her breast. The baby began to suckle. The blonde dropped to her knees before the red-haired woman in a display of gratitude. The redhead only snorted. Our hero looked at the red-haired girl and, bringing his hand to his mouth, gestured that he was hungry. The girl shook her head. He repeated the gesture, and again the girl shook her head. Slightly irked, he stepped toward her, took the baby from her hands and passed it to the boy, then placed his hands on her shoulders, turned her toward the hut, and gave her a gentle shove inside. He didn't have to wait long before the girl returned with a few pieces of damp, dried meat. The man sniffed at them without even taking them into his hands, grimaced, stepped back, and shook his head. It seemed the guest would be providing tonight's supper. He knew he couldn't fill him with magic, or at least, he shouldn't. He stepped up to the blonde, kissed her forehead again, then did the same to the redhead. Afterward, he wagged his finger at them both and lifted into the air. Moments later, he returned. Slung across his shoulders was a young deer. The deer was alive, but unconscious. He hadn't the faintest idea what customs prevailed here. He had once heard of tribes with very peculiar rituals regarding the animals they ate. He had no intention of offending anyone with his lack of tact. He looked over everyone once more. He had the distinct impression that during his absence, that all four of them, or rather all six, if one counted the youngest, hadn't even moved. He laid the deer gently on the ground. He drew a small knife and began looking around for someone to hand it to. In the end, he chose the boy. With a wave of his hand, he beckoned him closer. The boy passed his 1-year-old brother to his sister and limped slightly as he approached the deer. He took the knife with steady hands. Our hero had the feeling the boy already knew what he was doing. The sun was slowly sinking toward the west. A pleasant scent of roasting meat hung over the campfire. Everyone waited eagerly for supper to be ready. The women and children were hungry, and the mage was bored. He knew he ought to stay at least until everyone had eaten. The red-haired woman began dividing the meat. She cut off the first piece. Our hero watched her closely. The portion seemed quite decent. Before the woman decided who would receive it, he caught her hand, took the meat, bowed politely, and sat down on a stone to enjoy his supper. The redhead shook her head and continued dividing. The second piece she gave to the blonde, watching the man's eyes carefully. The next three she handed to her children, and only at the end did she cut a portion for herself. All of them, save the mage, waited to begin eating until the red-haired woman finished dividing and distributing the food. As soon as she had, they all bowed their heads and began muttering under their breath. Only then did the man realize he had done something wrong. He paused his meal, bowed his head as well, waited until the others began eating, and then continued with his supper. Afterwards, the red-haired woman and her children clambered into their hut. He followed them inside and gestured for the blonde to come in as well. The redhead tried to protest, but a raised index finger silenced her. When the women and children had settled to sleep, our hero crawled back outside. He intended to take a look around the area. At dawn, the mage set to work. He knew it would be wise to prepare something better than that primitive hut, especially if he were to spend more time here. He quickly mapped out a patch of land in his mind for the future construction. He cleared the ground of trees and stones, careful not to wake those sleeping nearby with his magical efforts. He gently lifted the turf and then drew up a great block of earth, leaving a hole for the coming structure. He set to building, or rather, pressing and firing the building from the chosen earth. The whole task took him perhaps an hour. The new building was finished, still warm, even quite hot. A simple, rectangular structure with a few windows, a door, and a large hearth topped with a modest chimney. He had even crafted transparent panes for the windows, a particularly clever bit of magic. The walls, made from fired and compressed earth, were mostly black, speckled here and there with pale spots. The roof he covered with the turf he had removed earlier. He was rather proud of himself. The house he had built was practical, sturdy, and quite handsome. As he stood there admiring his achievement, he didn't notice the inhabitants of the primitive hut slowly emerging outside. First, he noticed the blonde. As soon as she saw him, she ran up with the child in her arms. He gently patted her on the head. He pointed toward the new house and nodded proudly. The girl was about to step closer, but he stopped her. The walls had not yet cooled. He approached the building, touched a wall with his finger and hissed, making it clear it was hot. The blonde only tilted her head and looked at him, puzzled, evidently unfamiliar with the concept of firing houses from compressed earth. Right behind her appeared the red-haired family. The limping boy also wanted to go inside, but the man stopped him too. He caught his hand and brought it close to the wall. The boy said something in his language, which likely meant hot, because the others gave up on trying to enter. Seeing the boy's limp, the mage eyed him closely and looked carefully at his leg. He judged that something hadn't healed right after a break. With a decisive motion, he sat the boy down and began examining both legs. He glanced at the confused mother. He wondered briefly whether to attempt any explanation, but deemed it a waste of time. He lifted the boy into his arms, rose into the air, and landed with him on a branch. The red-haired woman began shouting, but he merely waved a hand in her direction. He snapped off a piece of branch, stuck it into the boy's mouth, and pressed down. He knew it would hurt. It comforted him somewhat that the boy seemed to expect it. He patted him on the head. Soon, there came a series of loud cracks from breaking bones. The boy groaned. The red-haired mother screamed louder, her voice full of sorrow. Our hero, however, was brave, and paid no mind to the shouting. He was already mending the leg with magic. After a moment, the operation was done. He gently slid down to the ground with the terrified, crying boy. As soon as the child's feet touched the earth, he ran to his mother. She kept shouting at the mage for a bit longer until she heard her daughter. She looked at her son, said something, but he only shook his head, clutching his mother tightly. Soon his sister spoke again. The boy turned to her and stepped closer. The mother, seeing he no longer limped, clapped her hands with joy. The man bowed his head politely and said, "I'm glad I could help." By noon, the new house had cooled. The mage had even prepared wooden doors. By evening, all the old and new inhabitants of the hut had moved their meager belongings into the new home. The mage, looking at the happy faces of the inhabitants, said to himself, "This is better than killing demonic cultists." Toward evening, he dug a well. With magic, of course. After supper, everyone began preparing for sleep. Once more he waited until the inhabitants had settled down, and once more he went on his patrol of the area.